All right, my name is Dave Beaver. Welcome to the Windows NT File System Developer Conference. This conference is kind of an interesting time for me. I've been helping a variety of companies in the industry, and you can probably guess who they are, develop file systems for Windows NT for the past 3 years. And during that time, I've been pushing to get the information necessary to do that out into the public. This is the first wave of that information. We hope in the future to be doing not necessarily more conferences like this, but more support for and more release of information that's pertinent to people who are doing file systems. I have a presentation on the file system kit, which we'll call it that right at this point in time, which is basically just the header files you need to layer on top of the DDK to write file systems with. And we'll see that sometime during the next couple of days. There's a schedule in the front of your slide booklets. You might all want to take a look at that. We should end up sometime around 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. The way the conference is designed is we'll start at a fairly high level with basically about an hour-long presentation to talk about just all a common ground. Let's go there. All right. Give us a common ground for our discussion in the future. Then we'll drill down pretty quickly into the I/O system, and then from there into file systems and into the components that the file systems deal with. Darryl Havens, who's the I/O architect, will be talking this morning, and Darryl first will do this common foundation I talked about, and then drill pretty quickly down into the I/O system and talk about how the I/O system supports file systems and device drivers of many sorts. In the afternoon, the first talk is Gary Kimura, who's the architect for the file systems, and Gary will talk about the overview of file systems, how a file system looks in Windows NT, how it interacts with Windows NT, how Windows NT makes use of the file system, and how it interfaces with the different components of Windows NT. From that point on, we're going to be talking about individual components of Windows NT and how those individual components interact with file systems, make use of file systems, and how the file systems make use of those components. In fairly fast order, Tom Miller will talk about the Cache Manager, which is a piece of Windows NT that allows file systems to intelligently cache files. On Wednesday, we'll start out with a set of ERPs by Brian Andrews, talking about locking and directory notify and blocks. Then Lou Perazzoli will come in. Lou's the architect of our memory subsystems, and Lou will talk about memory management interaction with the file systems. This talk is particularly gnarly because the file systems are used by memory management to page, and when you start paging, it gets interesting. Then, after lunch, before lunch on Wednesday, Jim Kelly, who's the architect of our security system, will be in to give you an in-depth overview of how security works. One of the things that I discovered in my talking to people is that people don't really understand security on Windows NT. Well, Jim has promised me by the time he gets finished with his talk, everyone will understand security on Windows NT. So, be a privileged few, including us, as Darryl puts it. After Jim talks, Robert Rochelle will be in to talk about writing secure file systems. He has examples from NTFS that should be interesting to you that demonstrate how NTFS implements its security in the NT system. And finally, the last person to talk will be David Goebel. David Goebel has probably the most interesting talk of the whole conference, in that he talks about file system synchronization, how to avoid deadlocks, how to interact with the other components of the system. Up to now, what you've talked about is the view of the file system from the other components. David's talk is interesting in that it talks about how the file system makes use of other components and other components make use of it, and how to avoid deadlocks. He puts a particularly interesting example of some deadlocks that we found in file systems just before we shipped Daytona. So this is a very, very timely example. On Thursday, we talk strictly about networking file systems. We started out with a talk about advanced TDI. I know in the introduction, in the advertisement about talk, we said we weren't going to really cover TDI. Well, one of the things that we discovered is that we really do need to cover TDI because most people who are writing file systems, especially distributed file systems, don't really understand how TDI works and how we've made some performance optimizations in TDI. Oh, transport driver interface. I'm sorry. That's the interface in kernel mode to the drivers, or to the transports. Thank you, Darryl. Then I'll talk again about, and I have some modicum of experience in this particular area. I'll talk again about servers. Servers are kind of an interesting beast in the file system arena. They aren't really file systems, but people tend to treat them like file systems, so we'll cover that in some detail. After that, Chuck Chan, who is a lead in our networking group, will talk about integrating a redirector into the system. One of the things you find out with distributed file systems in Windows NT, there's a lot of support mechanisms around the core of the redirector. Those support mechanisms are probably as difficult to integrate into the system as the actual redirector code itself is. So we spend a fair amount of time talking about integrating a redirector into the system. This includes things like integrating it into WinFile, making it possible to use the netview command, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's dozens of little things that Chuck talks about. Finally, the last talk will be Joe Lin. Joe is implementing our next generation redirector. He'll talk about redirectors. His talk is actually fairly interesting because by this time you know all of the information you need to know, or that's available, about doing a file system in Windows NT, and that's basically what a redirector is. However, there's lots of things you have to do in a redirector to optimize performance, and Joe will talk a lot about those sorts of things. That'll conclude what we're covering here. Go back to my overview slide. All right. We're not going to talk much at all about anything that's not in kernel mode here. If you don't know a lot about the device driver kit and you don't know a lot about writing kernel mode code in Windows NT, some of the things you run into may in fact go over your head a little bit. Don't worry about that. We want this conference to be very interactive. We want people to ask a lot of questions, give us a lot of feedback. This is kind of a new thing for us as well as for you, so we need some guidance into what people want to see. I should talk a little bit about logistics now. The event tonight, I'm told that we're having dinner and we have rented a nightclub named Intros. It is the VR capital of the world, supposedly. It is quite an interesting place from what I'm told. They have lots of video games, lots of VR games, etc. We'll be serving dinner, etc. there. So it should be interesting. I hope you can all come. We're all expecting you all to come. There will be buses running from here to Intros, and those buses, unless I'll actually call for a show of hands later in the day, but right now our plan is to have the buses run from here to Intros and then from Intros back to the hotel. If people would like to see something different than that, I'll call for a little show of hands later on so we can see what people want with that. We're fairly flexible on the buses. We sort of own them, so we can do what we want with them. I don't actually own them, but you get the point. Yeah. All right. As kind of a preliminary to this talk, I'd like to talk a little bit about file systems and the different types of file systems we've seen at Microsoft. As a part of the back office initiative, and I should mention that this is the end of the marketing spiel that you're going to see here. The only marketing person that's at this conference is me, and I'm not really a marketing person. I'm a software engineer in the marketing group. So we're pretty much really focused on the technical here. As part of the back office initiative, we've noticed that enterprises really want to see file systems. They have lots of legacy file systems. They want ported to Windows NT. They have tape backup systems that they want to run on Windows NT. So if we're going to sell Windows NT into enterprises and actually put these monster servers in enterprises, we need to ramp up support for file systems. Well, we're hoping you guys can do that. But in our talking about file systems, the batting around the file systems that we've done internally, we think there's basically 4 major characterizations of file systems. The primary one, the first one, the one that most people think about when they think about file systems is mass storage file systems. And those are something that writes to some glob of storage that's local to your machine. Typically, a need for a new mass storage file system is characterized by an enforced on-disk structure on the storage that you're using. A great example of this would be Worm and ECMA 167 file systems. Typically optical, because it has some limitations in the way it can be read, written, will require a new mass store file system. Typically speaking, these file systems will look like FAT. The next major category of file systems that we see are distributed file systems. These come in several different categories. There's true distributed file systems like DFS, or some people say Andrew fits into that category, some people don't. Sure. The next one, well, I don't know. I've never played around much with Andrew. So, the next category that you're all probably familiar with are redirectors or requesters, as Novell likes to refer to them. And they have, of course, their flip side, that's servers. These are typically the most complex file systems to implement as NT, because you're interfacing with a lot more pieces of the file system, and a lot of times you don't control performance characteristics of the file system. Joe Lin goes into great detail talking about implementing a redirector and trying to make it perform. These are, for Microsoft, probably the most interesting file systems right now, because these are the ones that enterprise customers typically want the most. This is where we have focused our efforts in the past, working with other companies to get redirectors built, redirectors or requesters. The next 2 major types are hierarchical storage. Some people call this nearline, some people call it HSM. Basically what it is a file system that migrates files off of expensive, fast storage devices onto less expensive, slow storage devices, and ultimately off into some horrible bucket somewhere that you can never get them back from, or at least in our lifetimes. These are actually probably very, very interesting to Microsoft as well, because again, this is something that enterprises tend to want to put into place. You know, terabyte and multi-terabyte file systems that really only have a couple of 100 gigabytes nearline. The final major type are jukeboxes, and we've only seen the interest in these recently, but they're actually kind of an interesting problem, because we're starting to see jukebox, especially CD-ROM jukeboxes, pop up that have 50, 100 spindles and 1,000 trays for CDs. Well, Windows NT has no rule that says you have to map a drive letter onto a particular spindle. However, WinFile kind of enforces that, or the file manager kind of enforces that, and there are a lot of people who are writing code assuming drive letters are available. Well, that whole model starts to fall apart when you start talking about 50 or 100 spindles. A, B, C, yeah. So this is interesting, this type of file system, and we believe that a file system will be required to support this kind of device. We believe these are going to be interesting in the near future too. One final type that's not on here, that's kind of not really a file system, and Darryl will talk about this some in his talk, is filters. I've seen more and more interest in people writing filters to do things like enforce encryption on files. They want to capture I/O at the read-write level and do nearline backups, for example, or hot backups onto other devices, or do encryption of data that's being written to the file system, or some kind of magical thing with that data, get it before it gets to the file system. This is another interesting one that I believe we present enough information at this conference to allow people to implement. As we go through the conference, and I cut between speakers and talk to you all, I'll try to draw attention to information that was presented in the last talk that may be important for each of these different kinds of file systems. Today, the talks are overview level, so this information is going to be important to all file systems, not just one particular type. So you all need to pay attention today. Tomorrow, we start getting into information that's more interesting for writers of one type of file system or another. Like I said earlier on, we want this conference to be as interactive as we can make it. If you have questions, the speakers will tell you beforehand. Some of the speakers really prefer not to be interrupted during talk because they've never talked in front of a large crowd before and they're really just nervous as hell. And they really want to get it over with. Some of them actually like being interactive and talking to you. So they'll tell you at the beginning of their talk which they prefer. In general, what we want you to do is ask questions. Think about the questions you have, ask them, by all means, get the information across.